gambling has been baked in or is embedded, is inseparable from the questions of freedom.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On? My guest this week is Fiona Nicoll, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Alberta. She's also the Alberta Gambling Research Institute Chair in Gambling Policy. And Fiona and I have a pretty fascinating and fun conversation about gambling. We talk about the role of the social sciences, the fact that not a lot of research is done beyond this idea of problem gambling or gambling as a vice. In other words, what role does gambling have in our everyday lives? What role does it have in terms of the games that we play and the way that we live our lives? Before we begin, I have to note that the Alberta Gambling Research Institute provides grant funding to support peer-endorsed academic investigations into many aspects of gambling. All contents of this discussion represent the views of the researcher only. Now, before we get to the conversation, I wanted to ask you for a favor. Please go to Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast app that you use, or even go to Facebook and give this podcast a rating and a review. Let me know what you think of this episode and of this show. You can also go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca, and get in touch with me by email or on social media and give me your thoughts, not just on this episode, but on what you think we should do for future episodes and for future guests on this show. All right. Fiona Nicoll, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Ben.
I'm really interested and excited to be here to talk with you today. We have a lot of things on the plate, on the agenda to talk about, but the main one is gambling. Mm-hmm. And there's one thing that I really appreciate in your writing about gambling. You've written a book, which is just about to come out, if it hasn't come out already, called...
It's out.
It's out, called Gambling in Everyday Life. And what I really appreciate about that book is that it's a cultural study of gambling that treats it not necessarily as a social ill right at the beginning. Because I think that our perspective, and certainly my perspective, if I were to walk into this conversation without having read your book, I would assume, okay, we're talking about how gambling is bad, how it's a problem, how it causes despair and disparity amongst people. All this may be true, but it kind of blinds us to what this thing actually is and why we do it. And this question of why people gamble, I think, is really important. And as you say in your book, it's often missing from the discourse, and that can cause problems. But that all being said, that's part of why I'm interested in talking with you. But I also really appreciate gambling because it is a form of enjoyment for people, and it's a game, like many other things. And a lot of the things that we do in modern society have been gamified, gambling being one of them. Finally, it's a $400 billion industry worldwide. I think in your book you mentioned that people spend globally almost as much on gambling as they do on pharmaceuticals, which is fascinating. We see pharmaceuticals as this mainstay of life in the 21st century. We're going to talk about all that stuff, Fiona, but first we've got the first question, which is always the same. And if you're ready for it, here we go. Fiona, what on earth is going on?
Ben, so much more than most people realize. I've recently done a meta-analysis of the research on gambling, and I've found that well over 2/3 of the research is in the health and psychological sciences. And that research focuses on a group of people between 1% and 5% of people who have documented problems with gambling. And a relatively small amount of interdisciplinary research exists, and an even smaller amount of research exists in humanities and social sciences, which is really odd because some of the earliest and most interesting theories of gambling came from the social sciences, and in particular Erving Goffman, who was a sociologist, one of the most important 20th century figures to understand social interaction. And he saw gambling as a prototype of social interaction and the ways in which in societies different groups of people gain a sense of confidence, a sense of competition in their search for the action. And he wrote a very famous essay called Where the Action Is. And he compared the gambler's search for action with the search for action of the thief or of the prostitute. And it's really interesting, that connection between risk and organised crime in that early sociological research on gambling. As gambling has become a lot more common and prevalent, when you ask, like, what on earth is going on? Well, esports, gambling on video games, fantasy sports leagues. There's a huge stadium for esports now in Las Vegas. This is a really growing field. Gambling on almost any kind of event, elections. This has been going on for quite a while. Gambling on stock movements. So there's a hell of a lot of gambling going on, and not very much research on what a whole lot of people are doing who are not in that system where they're being diagnosed and treated as problem gamblers. And it's really important to point out that even experts in that field will acknowledge that the majority of people who experience problems with gambling may not even tell themselves, and certainly don't seek treatment. So actually we don't know how many people out there are experiencing problems with gambling. You mentioned pharmaceuticals, and it's interesting to think about the issues around the opiates and the legal cases that are going on at the moment, and the recognition that big corporations and business interests have been involved in supplying what is a really dangerous and addictive substance. There are similar debates going on in gambling studies, but we don't hear a lot about them. A lot of these debates are quite comparable to the debates that are going on about gun control. And the question, in the case of gun control, there's that question of who pulls the trigger. Is it the person, or is it the system that makes lethal weapons readily available? And in the case of gambling, there's a particular technology that is most familiar as slots, but is called in the literature electronic gaming machines. And there are arguments by researchers that are comparing these machines with big tobacco. And there is a tension within the research. The vast majority of research assumes that it is the person rather than the product that is involved in gambling harms. So that's quite an interesting debate. It is likely to grow more prominent, but like I said, a lot more is going on than under the surface.
Yeah, in your book, you actually quote John Stuart Mill and how he talked about in his book On Liberty, which is a cornerstone of Western political thought, that gambling, like prostitution, is kind of right on the line between what we should prohibit and restrict completely and that which we should be free to do. It's just one of those tricky areas that we can't totally get rid of it as government or as a society, but we also can't completely allow it. And going on what you said, I noticed right before I came into your office, that outside your door is a story about the Ellen slot machines. Ellen DeGeneres has allowed her image to be used on slot machines in Las Vegas. And I visited Las Vegas a couple of years ago and saw them and was like, oh, okay, well, that didn't really make sense, but I guess it makes sense because there's money to be made. And there's a corollary here, I think, in this age of social media where you have these major tech companies, whether it's Apple or Google or Facebook, who have become so expert in manipulating their programs to ensure that you will just stay on for a few minutes longer and click a few more times. I imagine that with a $400 billion industry, the companies that make slot machines like the Ellen DeGeneres machine know just how to keep people there a little bit longer or bring them to the machine in the first place. There's something disarming about Ellen's face being on that machine. I remember seeing this, and I'm not a gambler, but I just realized, wow, the things that will be done to get me to be involved in this thing. And the final thing I wanted to say in response to what you were just talking about is that, and it's mentioned a lot in your book about how the culture and the idea of gambling as you just said, is much more than just a slot machine or a game of poker. It actually has animated how we live our daily lives. We live them according to risk and risk management and getting a reward, but throwing the dice. And maybe I'll get a reward today, even if it's not guaranteed to me. And pursuing the action that you mentioned earlier. And all of this stuff, I realized in reading your book, is prevalent and very present in capitalist Western culture, even if we don't realize it. And the casinos are kind of just the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, absolutely. It's a wonderful summary, in fact, of many of the arguments through the book. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Anytime.
You really deliver. Okay, so I'm really glad that you began with John Stuart Mill, because that is a foundational text on liberty and the idea that the aim of individuals is to maximize themselves with the freedom that a well-designed and minimal state will allow them. So that idea is fundamental. And what is interesting, on the other hand, is that he's recognizing even then that, and I also like to point out that we remember on liberty using a man's name, John Stuart Mill, but that was the most important book that he co-wrote with Harriet Taylor.
Right.
And she was probably by most accounts the main source of that particular argument. So it's really interesting to realise that maybe what we would think of as feminism was engaged in the very beginning of our ideas of liberty. Anyway, at this point, the question that they're exploring, Harriet Taylor and John Stuart Mill, is what do we do about this class of activities that do not seem in the social interest or in the interest of individuals? So what do we do about the citizens who do not live upright lives in monogamous relationships of marriage, but visit prostitutes? What do we do with people who drink alcohol to excess? And what do we do with people who gamble away their money?
And what do we do with gun control, too, might be another one.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's in the book I don't discuss that, but yeah, it's very much about, I guess, the abuses of liberty and the opportunities for the state to benefit from the abuses of liberty. Now, this becomes really important in the neoliberal context, which is the context that we're in now, where, income tax, corporate tax is very unpopular. In the case of Alberta, where we're speaking, royalties for the last few years have been less than taxes gained through gambling.
Royalties from oil and gas.
Royalties from oil and gas. So it's not unusual for around 10% of all of a state or province's revenue to come from gambling taxes. So we can see, and I argue, that gambling has been baked in or is embedded, is inseparable from the questions of freedom that capitalism and theories and systems developed to foster capitalism value. So it's not, I argue it doesn't matter how much we do or don't regulate gambling. It's actually really difficult to imagine a capitalist democratic society without gambling. So the question is, how do we organise it? And one of the very interesting figures in this story is B.F. Skinner, who wrote a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, where he argues against what he calls the literatures of freedom and the ways in which those literatures posit a subject of free will. Now, he was a really important behavioural scientist. He was also an excellent writer. And there he takes slot machines in their early form as this proof, if you like, of the social impact of the science that he was discovering in studying pigeons. And I don't want to get too much into the science, but just to say that it is possible to design devices and to package substances in such a way that the free will of individuals is overridden. And we are seeing that a lot in debates, not just about gambling machines, but about social media,
Absolutely.
as you mentioned.
Well, that I just can't compete. How can I possibly compete against corporations that are now worth $1 trillion and devoting so much resources to manipulating and controlling, or at least nudging me in the right direction? And behavioral scientists and psychologists have clearly shown that that conformity actually changes our perception. There's a book that I read not long ago, because I'm actually going to interview the authors, Zaya Tong, who wrote a book called The Reality Bubble. And towards the end of the book, she cites a study, which has been redone many, many times, where you have a bunch of people in a room, you show them 3 lines, and then you show them 1 line, and you say, well, which line is the same length as, which line of the 3 is the same length as the one over here? If you just give them free rein, you'll have 1% say the wrong thing. 99% will get it. If you have actors in the room who are convinced that the one line is actually corresponding to a different line, then 75% of people in this one study will go with that point of view. Even if we know that objectively it's easy to measure. In fact, there's only a 1% error rate. But 75% will go with the prevailing view. And now what scientists argue is not that we're scared, and not that I guess I'll just go what they're telling me, because there's no incentive to say the right or the wrong thing. I'm just telling you what I see. That actually the conformity and the need to be part of the group alters my perception. So I see that one line that is not actually the correct line is the one that they are telling me is correct. So my perception has been altered. I think that Facebook, Apple, Google know this, and I think that maybe the designers of casinos and electronic slot machines, and maybe even a craps table, might have thought about this, and that bringing you into this is not really about your own free will or your own personal choice. It's about making sure that the context and the atmosphere and the environment is there, and that the nudges are pointing you in the right direction. And that on average, I will fall prey to it. On average, I will check my phone every 5 minutes. On average, I will just give into Facebook and go back into it after I've decided I'll never go back, right? And I think that sounds like gambling to me. That sounds like people who vow to be done with gambling forever after they finally came out of a casino with $20,000 and they're back a week later. And in the casinos I've been to and the people I've spoken to, anecdotally, that's very common in the gambling world.
Yeah, you raise a really interesting question about what does it mean to think about gambling and non-gambling activities and practices as part of a single spectrum, rather than as the way that we conventionally think of them, as we think of gambling as a very specific domain which is quite highly regulated. You have to be of a certain age in order to do it. And there's a lot of questions coming up, but a lot of conferences and things on blurring the lines, particularly around something called loot boxes, which exist in some video games. And some jurisdictions, including at least one in Europe, have decided that video games with these loot boxes in them, which are basically an opportunity to win a item of in-game value, are a form of gambling. So the question of where we draw lines between what is gambling and what isn't gambling is really important.
Can I just ask, is gambling under the umbrella of playing games, or is there something fundamentally different about gambling because it involves a financial reward?
It's an interesting question. In many ways, the scholarship just looks, this 2/3 of research on gambling, just looks at legal commercialized gambling industries and the products that they supply. But yeah, I mean, there's gambling doesn't have to be for money. This is, if you go back to Irving Goffman, it might involve things like esteem. It might involve non-material things of value that you put on the line, for example. So there's ways of thinking of them together. But I want to talk about something in the book that I found really, one of the great things about this book was I interviewed people in the same way that we're talking now, who have engaged in different ways with gambling. And I interviewed a guy who worked for a large financial institution doing risk analysis. For this guy, gambling was barely separate from what he did every day as his job. And he described the way that he bet on sports online. So he was a really big online sports bettor as arbitrage. And as basically, he would manage risk by having accounts with, I think he had 11 accounts with different providers. And he would always bet on promotional offers, which is like where you get the best deal. And he would always make sure that he was never down by more than $50. But if something really random happened, he could be up a lot. And for him, it was like he would talk about his experience. He relates one time he was a father with several young children, and it was his anniversary of his marriage. It was the first time he'd been to a movie with his wife in, I think, several years. And he talks about going on the train from work to meet her, and he's betting all of the time. And then, he's having this meeting. Sorry, I shouldn't call it a meeting, but it must have felt like a meeting to him, because really what he wanted to be doing was checking his bets. But it was like, no, this is the first time I've managed to be alone with my wife for a year. And I was interested in, how did he engage with gambling platforms, sports gambling platforms? And so it was absolutely on the spectrum of the way in which he engaged with all kinds of other arbitrage in his day job. But he was very assertive when it came to dealing with the companies. And what he found is he would be cut off because he was so successful, because he was applying these same skills. And he was very assertive in making sure that these companies followed through on the terms and conditions that he had signed up to. So I found that really an interesting example of continuity.
Well, and at the end of your book, you actually cite your own personal example of leaving Australia and figuring out what to do with your retirement savings that you'd built up at the time, and having different advice over the several year period of what to do, and that you realized that this was gambling, that you realized that what the market was forcing you to do was to gamble with your financial assets as if you were in a casino. Some people have said that the stock market is, in the short term, if you trade day to day or over the course of a single day or even a single hour, is indistinguishable from a stock market or indistinguishable from a casino. That you're essentially just doing the same thing. But over time, the opposite, over the course of many years, the opposite of a casino happens. It's weighted in the favor of stocks going up over time in general, whereas in general, a casino is weighted to the house advantage over time. And I mention this because I really found it interesting at the end of your book. You're kind of saying to us, we all have money, we all have savings, or at least most of us. We're all in a way gambling. And even when we go to school, come out of school, what are you going to do with your career? Well, you're gambling. We even use that language. You're gambling with your career. You're gambling with your life. And we can't escape it. And it's not just a throwaway term. I think it really is a truth of how we live in the 21st century.
And that's really important because it's often used as a metaphor, as though playing the stock markets is like gambling. But there's all kinds of examples where it can literally be that. This wasn't an interview I did, but I cite an interview in the book with a woman who was involved in a creative project with other people who were experiencing problem gambling. And she wrote really vividly about the experience of discovering the stock market trading platform. And she was going through a really hard time in her life. She'd had pretty acrimonious divorce. Obviously, looking down the barrel of some serious poverty. And so she turned to these day trading, and the ways in which she describes the appeal of the platforms themselves is so similar to the ways that other contributors to this creative project describe their experience of being in specific venues full of slot machines. So it was quite fascinating, and definitely I argue that gambling is more than a metaphor. And I guess a big question in the book is if we can become aware of not just what makes gambling separate and different from the rest of our everyday life, but consistent with it, what ideas might we have for making not just our everyday lives better, but for making gambling better?
And more enjoyable and less vicious, I guess might be a word to put it, like the stock market can be, and like trading in an app on your phone can be. Because I think that there's a truth to that, right? If I'm addicted to looking at my phone in the same way that I'm addicted to getting the treasure box in a game that didn't cost me money, that doesn't cost me money to play, there's an opportunity in there. And this is actually a story from your book where a student of yours actually answered a question in class and said, why do people seem so anxious? I can't remember if it was gambling or what the story was.
It was about why are people so anxious during game shows?
Game shows like Deal or No Deal.
Yeah, because it's not even their money.
Yeah, it's the company's money that they're going to lose. And it's because they're not anxious of losing that money. They're anxious of losing the opportunity to win. And that is a truth in all of our lives that I think we can all relate to. Why are we afraid of aging? I think because we're afraid we've missed the opportunity to acquire fame and fortune, or missed the opportunity to do the thing we always wanted to travel around the world, or whatever it is. These missed opportunities, financial or otherwise, are exactly what, for me, in reading your book, animate gambling as an action and as an activity.
Yeah, absolutely. There's also a sphere of gambling that's very old, and that is as old as the process of the European Enlightenment and the expansion of European powers into the countries that we are now meeting together on, the settler colonial occupying countries like Canada, New Zealand, and Canada and sorry. What is interesting about that is the role that lotteries played in establishing colonial settlements, and so from that period through to the ways in which lotteries are used to subsidise arts, are used to subsidise really hospitals, really big projects. Lotteries are a really good example of the ways in which states and empires have always required gambling.
Is it a way to kind of say, to throw your hands up and say, this is chance? We're not responsible for the outcome. We're giving it over to the gods, so to speak. I know that recently with cannabis legislation across Canada, lotteries are used to determine who gets to build a cannabis dispensary in a certain neighborhood or in a certain community. And it's kind of a way for government to say, hey, we didn't decide to put it there. We didn't decide who was going to run this place. That was chance. That was just luck of the draw. And it's a way to kind of abdicate responsibility. Do you think that's a motivation for government, even going back to the colonization period in New Zealand or Canada?
Yeah, and even before that, the Roman period, you have gambling. It doesn't seem to exist in all cultures, but it exists in many cultures and has done for millennia. And it has been involved in statecraft, and it's that, I guess, sweet spot where the state is getting revenue, but the individuals involved in the process are getting hope and an opportunity. And sometimes, as you say, it provides a way of abdicating responsibility. One of the really interesting examples in my book, which kind of takes us back to this question of problem gambling, because what I'm not arguing is that we shouldn't look at problem gambling. I'm actually arguing that we need to take a different angle, I guess, if you
A
like,
more
look at
holistic
gambling.
angle.
Yeah, more holistic, and like what happens when we look at gambling through the lens of everyday life rather than through the lens of an individual's pathology. And what happens is a whole lot of social aspects of gambling become clear. And in fact, it's really quite difficult to think about gambling as something that only involves an individual. So I became really interested in the kinds of social contexts and the kinds of belongings that gambling gives rise to. And I did quite a lot of research in workplaces. And gambling's a little crazy in Australia, like a little, I think, more crazy than like elsewhere. It's deeply embedded into the culture. But I interviewed a guy who was kind of working in a fairly menial job in a large public sector organisation, who was part of a lottery pool, and he never expected that they would ever win. There was 10 of them. They each put in like $1 every week. He won $100,000. They all won $100,000. And so it was interesting just to find out about what does it feel like? What does it feel like to win the lottery? And what changes in a social sense? There's a little research on this, but I think there's scope for a lot more. In the case of this guy, so he couldn't believe it, and he went to work the next day, and he was just worried. He thought, I've got so much to do, and I've won this lottery, you know, and how am I going to get through everything? So he went and told his boss, and he was very apologetic. Oh, look, I'm really sorry, you know, we won the lottery. And his boss said, Graham, that's not his real name, go to the pub and don't come back. You know, just enjoy the moment. Meanwhile, the group appointed him like the spokesperson. So all these media people came to his office, and, you know, he had to hold up a big check. But what was interesting is he was really reflective about it, and he described it as being like a death in the family. He said, it's always something that happens to someone else, not you. And
Interesting.
It was so interesting. He said it was just like living in a bubble for that time. It's like the rest of the world is going on, but you're somehow not part of it. The most interesting part of my conversation with him was when I asked him to reflect on, okay, so what was the impact of this, not just on yourself? In his case, he bought a car and he paid off some of his mortgage, but on the whole group. And he said in the case of 9 out of the 10 people, it was all like happiness and balloons. But for one person, it made a negative impact on this person's life. And almost within hours of winning, this person was down at the bank insisting that the lottery company give him his money. And that evening he went to the casino and he blew like $6,000 in one night. And, you know, this person had struggled with some other issues around addiction. And so Graham said something that I was just quite... I've got to say I was blown away by it. He said, if it wouldn't have made this person's life worse, I would gladly not have won the money myself. And I really didn't expect him to say that. I mean, he said, look, the money was great, but, you know, if this wouldn't have happened, then, you know, I would rather have not got that money than to see him suffer in that way. And then it made me think about, okay, how much are we prepared to accept in terms of the harms of gambling? So most of the literature focuses on these very small number of people, and governments have to say, well, look, you know, we have less than 1% of problem gamblers this year. You know, okay, maybe you've got 100,000. You know, does that justify supplying a dangerous product? Particularly in areas where there aren't a lot of other options for entertainment. And this is typically where a lot of the most dangerous gambling products are placed. If one person is harmed by that, does that justify the decision to allow these products to operate in a very lightly regulated ways?
Now, one thing in this conversation that sticks with me is this idea that it's hard to imagine a Western society, or frankly any society, without this concept of gambling. And so we have to then ask, what do we do about it? How do we organize it? If it's something that we know is going to exist, then how do we face that reality? Now, coming up in this conversation is this question of the freedom to gamble as opposed to the freedom from gambling, a positive versus a negative right. You may have the freedom to go to a slot machine, but do you also have the freedom to live in a society where you're not pressured to go to a slot machine? The same can be said for social media. It's an interesting question, and it's all coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On.
Yeah, there are certainly areas of life in which we would say very clearly, even if it hurts one person, that's too much. Seatbelts, for example, the fact that seatbelts are now you have to wear them. And then it is not a crime, but it's a misdemeanor. You'll get in trouble. You get fined if you don't wear your seatbelt. Well, I mean, I don't know how. Yeah, there's a lot of people whose lives are saved by that, whose injuries are diminished by having a seatbelt. But there's a restriction of personal liberty that comes with that. But there's also this idea of the burden of money, and this idea that freedom can become a constraint. Freedom can become, or a certain thing that we identify as freeing. A car, for example. Going back to that idea, a lot of people see their car as giving them the freedom to drive wherever they want, whenever they want, to go off after Friday after work and drive for 4 hours and find a campsite somewhere. But for the majority of people, for the majority of the time, it seems that the vehicle is a burden. It's a burden on my psychology. It's a burden on where's my car, how am I paying for it. It's not this freeing vehicle that we think it should be. And there's a statistic that I can't quote, I don't know if it's true, and I don't remember where it came from, but that in the long term, for those who win about $1 million or more, 9 out of 10 are worse off in terms of their meaning and fulfillment and happiness in life 20 years later. 9 times out of 10, winning the lottery is not a good thing. This thing that should be freeing, that gives us all of this opportunity, is actually something that shuts us down and puts a burden on us. And it's not just the pathology of going into a casino and blowing it all. I think it's also the feeling of being maybe being beholden to your friends and family to help them out, to be the person who got lucky, who was fortunate, who landed good fortune and is therefore responsible for dispensing that to their community or to their people. Whatever it is, it's so interesting that freedom can become the exact opposite of freedom.
Freedom, you cannot think about gambling without this ideal of freedom, and I actually see gambling as a really important vehicle through which the value of freedom is disseminated through society. And a lot of the debates in the field of gambling studies are about, how do we encourage people to gamble more responsibly. So you will see in a given gambling venue a whole lot of posters that will say, do you know how much you're spending? Remember to gamble responsibly. So this is the idea that the onus of freedom is on the self-controlled individual. And so it's the freedom to gamble, and it's also the freedom to develop very profitable products for companies and also for states to have that freedom, that capacity to generate income when, as I mentioned earlier, income taxes, corporate taxes are not popular. But freedom from gambling and certain kinds of gambling is equally important. And I guess all of these ways in which gambling works through this value of freedom in liberal and neoliberal societies, I think are really important because debates become very ideological, very much presupposed on an idea of a rational, calculating, self-interested individual, which something like behavioural economics, you mentioned nudging before, has really debunked. I mean, that's actually not how we operate. So why we expect people in contact with a product that has been designed to keep them there, to behave responsibly and exercise their free will, I find quite, I find it a paradox. I understand why it exists.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, states need this money, but I think there's a lack of creativity.
Well, and there's this paradigm that we live in, that we're all these autonomous units who can make our choices, and make moral choices that are not influenced by Apple, a $1 trillion company, trying to influence my decision, or just the maker of a casino game or an electronic slot machine, and that I should somehow just be able to. It's not 50-50. It's not the flipping of a coin. That it's much, much weighted in the favor of those who are trying to get me, those who are trying to pull the money out of my wallet. Mm-hmm. And it's a fascinating idea, because we live under the illusion that it is something else. We operate in everyday life as if we have this autonomy. And our minds are, I mean, this is going back to the work of Yuval Noah Harari and other scholars more recently, that the mind is a storytelling machine that rationalizes yourself to yourself at all times of every second of every day. Mm-hmm. And therefore, it would be fatal to that storytelling machine to learn that I'm not in control, that I'm not deciding that I should be gambling today, that I'm not actually in control of when I pick up my phone or put down my phone. And I think that there's, like, as you mentioned, there's a certain irresponsibility of our way of life today, in terms of not accepting that there are big players here who we can't compete with most of the time.
Absolutely. I think that story is really important, and I think that mostly that's what's going on. But what I discovered is another level of freedom, like, if you like, below the surface. And that is actually what made me interested in gambling in the first place. Now, I want to share a game with you. So what I have in my hand is a wooden paddle with 2 coins on it. And this is an Australian game called 2 Up. I became interested in it because I first saw it being used at an annual parade of ex-service personnel called Anzac Day in Australia, which is also a public holiday. And at that stage, I'd been doing research on nationalism. So I was following the parade to this hotel, which also had a whole lot of slots and VLTs in it. And then I saw something unfold before my eyes, and it involved this piece of wood with these 2 coins. And everybody created a circle around one person who was flipping this coin and yelling out what they would bet on, whether it would be 2 heads in a row, 2 tails in a row, or whether it would be a combination of odds. So let's have a listen.
Sure.
You probably couldn't hear that in Radio Land, but I'll describe what happens. So it's a really loud game. It's very anarchic, because you have a lot of people are putting bets on what the coin flipper has decided, but all these other people are making bets on the side. None of this is done in a particularly formal way. There's a whole lot of trust around it. There's quite possibly burglaries around it, for all I know. But I saw this kind of highly social form of gambling. It was such a contrast to, like, people sitting in their little at their little machines in the next room. I became interested in this. Like, what possibilities does gambling in everyday life offer? And one of the opportunities that gambling offers is to do things differently in organisations. And when I'm talking about organisations in Australia, I'm talking about all kinds of organisations which on one day of the year, where a horse race called the Melbourne Cup is run, everything stops. The newspapers say this is, and everybody says in the media, this is the race that stops the nation. So I decided to do research to find out what happens when the nation stops. What happens at this time when this particular horse race is run? And all kinds of things happen at all levels. I was in one state in Australia where I surveyed my students, and over 60% of them had been doing this regularly at school. I surveyed people in this large public sector workplace, and 80% of them had been part of these celebrations throughout their working career in all kinds of industries. So what's going on? Now, one of the things that's going on is it provides an opportunity to bring people at different levels of an organisation together in a different way. And I interviewed a woman who had retired from working in a university, but she found this extremely useful to do all kinds of things. For example, graduate students at university can be a very isolated group. So she would hold a book sale for them. But she would, so she would raise funds, but she would also insist that everybody wore a stupid costume. And this is actually a big, they call these hats called fascinators in Australia. So people would wear silly hats. People would wear earrings, which were 2 wine glasses hanging off them. And she used this really strategically as a way to break down what was becoming an increasingly alienated experience of work. It's also interesting how gambling is gendered, and the organisation of these events very often fell to women. And most often she was like a rare prof who actually organised these events, but often in Australia they fall to people at a lot of women who work at that administrative level, receptionists, at that kind of level. It's like a kind of social club. But I think gambling in everyday life does offer opportunities. Football competitions were used in the workplace as a way of bringing people who'd come from different parts of the country together to talk about sports and to trash talk. And also even at the level of really organised extractive commercial gambling, there's a kind of way that relationships, even in a casino, can... There's practices of care that I observed which were really striking. In one case, we had as the challenge for people who use VLTs in their premises, and in Australia a lot of that happens in pubs, is to keep them generating profits. And if someone goes broke, it's like this is no longer a customer. Also there's been some negative PR around slots, which we call pokies. And so at one stage the companies who ran these hotels put a whole lot of pressure on their staff to extract money, from as much money as they could from customers, giving them orders to create pseudo-intimate relationships to play their favourite music and those things. It's really interesting hearing about the ways that people could not do that, because you're working with someone, they're coming in on a regular basis, you can establish a different kind of relationship with them. None of this is like revolutionary stuff, but it's quite important to recognise that within the sphere of legal organised gambling, it's not exclusively or only extractive, but also that we need to imagine or rediscover ways of gambling which are more social, less extractive. And if gambling is inherently interwoven into liberal capitalism, then why is it that we feel like we have so little voice in the sorts of products that we're confronted with?
Well, and there's a word that I kept coming back to as you were talking there, which applies to when you first brought out 2 up and you flipped up the coins. And when you said when you said, okay, let's do this, the feeling I had was, oh, fun.
Yeah.
Let's have fun. It felt fun when you did it. When you described the Melbourne Cup, that one day that stops the nation, it sounds like fun. It sounds like, say, when the Canadian hockey team in the Olympics goes to the gold medal game, the whole country, for the most part, is watching this. People who don't watch sports are watching this. There's a fun sense of camaraderie, and we're all united together in victory or in defeat. And it transcends, as you were saying before, it transcends station. I mean, the rich person in their massive resort home is watching it at the same time as someone who's homeless but coming in off the street into a pub and watching it. There are those who aren't, but it seems to it's a great leveler. And I think going back to we're in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Alberta and talking about political science. The idea that governments are looking for these things that level out and give us an escape valve or a steam valve to blow stuff off so that we don't actually take to the streets to protest the disparity of wealth, or, this is going back to different thinkers. But still there's this idea of fun, which I can't avoid but feel when you describe some of these things. And I think what happened, and just as Facebook was fun when it first came out, I remember back in, must have been 2006 or 7, and I was a holdout for a couple of years, and now, it doesn't even matter. We're in 2019, yeah. And I remember feeling the first time I went on it, ooh, it was fun. Oh, you get to find this person. What's this person doing? It was fun. It's not fun. Facebook is not fun at all. And someone once told me that it's like a drug. And it's like sometimes a drug addict can, at the beginning, the first time you do a particular drug, it's 99% pleasure, 1% pain. But over time, it becomes 99% pain, 1% pleasure. But you chase that 1%. That tiny little bit that you get is the same tiny bit that you get when you're sitting in front of a VLT. There's still a modicum of fun or a memory or a nostalgia of fun in there. And I find that word maybe missing from the conversation, because that is why we do it. That is, in part, the game aspect of it, because it's fun. And I want you to flip the coins again, and I want to guess. I want to say there are going to be 2 heads. I'm excited about it. Let's do it.
Okay. So at the moment, the paddle has 2 heads. Okay. Come in, spinner.
We've got 1 head.
Okay, we've got 1 head. We've got 2 heads.
2 heads.
This is good. We want to go for 3.
Okay, you mean we're going to guess 2 heads again?
That's what you want. But
okay, I want
to
2
bet
heads.
against you.
Okay, but I'm allowed to guess something else?
You're not going to get your money. You've got to get 3 in a row.
I got to get 3 in a row. Okay, I want 2 heads. Yeah,
okay.
All right.
Oh, you have a head and a tail, which doesn't help me.
Because
I want 2 tails.
Right.
Yeah, so I guess but that was fun.
Yeah.
I'll be playing this with my students in a class in a few weeks' time, because I think I don't call it fun. I actually, in the book, I describe it as enjoyment.
Enjoyment,
because and I look at 3 aspects of enjoyment. I look at enjoyment, and enjoyment is that sense that you have to do something. So maybe you have to play that machine like a pigeon in the Skinner box, or you have to join in the festivities on Melbourne Cup Day. Like, some people hate it, and there's increasing concern about the injury of horses and things.
Right.
So you have these enjoyments. But you also have this enjoyment that I describe as joining. So it's that way in which gambling joins people together.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important and really powerful. There's another aspect of it which has to do with joy. And to be honest, I think I'll probably be searching for that for the rest of my life. Like, what is the unique joy that gambling, and gambling alone, provides? So I play with these meanings between enjoyment, joining, and joy, and as a way to get a deeper understanding of the social work of gambling in everyday life, because sometimes we just say, okay, well, it makes me happy. You know, a lot of people would say it's just a bit of fun. And a more insidious side of that is where the research that is dedicated to problem gambling will be used by states which really need the money to claim that, okay, you know, we've got this 1% of people, they're harmed by it, they probably were vulnerable already, or, you know, if it wasn't that, it would be something else.
Right, like a sin tax.
Yeah. But for everyone else, it's just a bit of fun. And I just think that's not good enough.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah.
Even though, I think we were having fun, but I think we're also participating in a kind of enjoyment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember you said this, you're going to be chasing this for the rest of your life. For me, it's not so much gambling as I played a lot of video games when I was growing up. And that idea of the treasure box from Super Mario Brothers, that original game that had money all over the place, the money got you nothing. The money didn't help you win the game faster. It didn't earn you special abilities. It's just money. I mean, maybe it gave you extra lives. I don't remember if that's true or not, but they were dotted everywhere, and you really needed to get it, and you wanted to open that treasure box. And if you missed it, it was the missed opportunity, you know, and it was this, you know, and that way of conditioning that I experienced is going to be with me for a while. And so it kind of begs the question, to what extent is this fundamentally fun? Or to what extent have we been conditioned to believe this is fun? And there are so many questions I have in this conversation as we approach the end. There's this idea of governmentality from Michel Foucault that you use a lot in your book, that our actions and our behavior is shaped by government, and our actions and behavior are shaped by gambling, by this concept, not as metaphor, but its actual thing. Also this idea that we hit on earlier about negative versus positive rights, the freedom to gamble as opposed to the freedom from gambling. And this idea, I remember reading Naomi Klein's book, No Logo, some years ago. I don't know if you're familiar with it. And it was the first time I'd ever heard someone say, shouldn't you have the freedom to not see billboards? Shouldn't you have the freedom to not be advertised to all the time? Shouldn't that be a freedom? Or is it just the freedom of corporations to put a billboard in front of you? Is that the only freedom that there is? And I think when we talk about gambling, there is this conflict between the freedom to gamble and the freedom from gambling that a lot of people crave on both ends. But Fiona, I want to ask you my 10 things that I'm doing at the end of every conversation. And some of these will give us a chance to double back on some of these ideas. But really, brevity is a gift with this one. So let's try to be brief. Just with each one, you can have an emotional response, one sentence, one word, whatever. The first one is play.
Could be a gamble, Ben.
It is a gamble. It's I'm gambling for interest here.
Okay, play.
Play.
An aspect of gambling, but no more important than work or finance.
And you talk in your book about how play and work and finance and investment are at the intersection of what gambling is. The second one is this word, enjoyment.
What needs to be understood more about gambling? What is the enjoyment? I liked what you said about recalling the video game, and it made me think about the fear of missing out that we experience with social media, and whether that's a kind of jackpot that we're always searching for, you know, that social media will deliver us the event, will deliver us the approval.
Yeah, fear of missing out, that's a huge motivator, I think, in our world today. The third one is everyday life.
So when we think about people affected by the harms of gambling, we're not thinking about all of the ways in which we may be involved or actually participating in gambling with our friends. Everyday life is a lens through which gambling looks different from the focus on the problem. Yeah.
The fourth one is actually a person, Michel Foucault.
So I really think he needed to consider gambling and gambling's role in governmentality, and that's what I try to do.
Yeah, cool. Learning.
Oh, gambling is increasingly an important way that we learn to comport ourselves as citizens in neoliberal competitive societies. Poker is probably one of the best examples of that.
Video games.
Watch this space. Yep, just watch this space. It's where a lot more of the gambling action is going to happen in the next decade.
Poker.
Poker. There's been so many books about the role of poker in developing the skills one needs for success. It is celebrated as a frontier game. It's very much part of the self-image of the West, of American exceptionalism. And one of the best things from the book was me reading a book by a former Wall Street, actually I think he's still a Wall Street trader, called Aaron Brown, called The Poker Face of Wall Street, where he described interviews for people who wanted to work in high finance, and he said, look, it wasn't the boardroom that mattered, it was the poker room afterwards where it was decided whether you got the job or not.
Interesting. Democracy.
The freedom to participate in the choices that are made about what kind of gambling spaces we have, what kind of gambling moments we have, and what kind of gambling products are available.
Privacy.
Gambling is not strictly a private matter. If we really want to understand what gambling does, we're best to look at the ripples around an individual.
And last one is betting.
A bit of fun. I'm really going against everything I've argued in this book. Okay.
Brilliant.
I want to say something that can make everyday life more unpredictable and enjoyable.
Okay. Great. Fiona, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Ben.
To learn more about Fiona Nicoll, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes as well as links to social media and a way to get in touch with me. Now, your quote of the week is from Edmund Burke, the 18th century philosopher and thinker, who said that gambling is a principle inherent in human nature. Now, if we accept Burke's quote, what do we do about it? How do we handle this principle that exists in our nature, if it's even true? Thanks, as always, to our composer Andrea Wetstein, and special thanks for this episode to the University of Alberta Department of Political Science for giving us the chance and a space in which to record.